Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel titled Tokenizing the Real World. And then we'll touch infrastructure, protocol, and use cases. And today, we are diving into some interesting application of blockchain technology. And I like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves briefly. Reina, please, your turn.
Hi, I'm Reina Li. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto. So my research is on tokenization frameworks and tokenization, how it operates with DeFi spaces, and what kind of efficiency gains that we can get from that. And the work that I do is a little bit niche. Maybe it's specifically looking a lot about DeFi protocols, and there's a little bit of contention on how open do we want DeFi protocols to be when it comes to tokenizing real-world assets. So there's some areas there that we have to balance, and that's kind of where my research lies. Yeah.
Okay. Peter, your turn.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Peter Adriaens, I'm at the University of Michigan, jointly between the College of Engineering and the Ross School of Business. I run a Center for Digital Asset Finance there, where we look at tokenization of real-world assets. We're funded by financial institutions and asset managers, such as pension funds, sovereign wealths, and the bond market around agriculture to look at tokenization opportunities and unlocking liquidity and reducing cost of debt in those markets. So this is it's a large-scale enterprise, I guess, with various different types of real-world assets, I guess, that we're exploring.
Okay, thank you. I also like to introduce myself. I'm Echo Huang. I'm working at the university with 28,000 students. It's the largest polytech in Taiwan. Most of our students, they can do engineering and programming. So they like to have a hands-on experience to try different blockchain technology. So we jumped to XRP ledgers last September. And this early year, I submit a paper, title kind of RWA, but I received this reject immediately. So that's why I want to continue my research with our colleagues, and you might help me to make our paper can publish later. Okay, and then I'd like to ask Reina, could you share your research experience regarding anything about RWA?
Okay, so my research experience, so I worked on tokenizing assets. So the main question that we tackled was essentially when you have your assets, if you wanted to work with DeFi protocols. So one of our goals is that we think that operability with DeFi is really important because it's really the DeFi protocols that bring a lot of the efficiency gains that we can see when it comes to tokenization. And so suppose you have some assets that you own that are tokenized on-chain, and you want to provide liquidity to a liquidity pool, whether that's an AMM or a lending pool or whatnot. Now, there's usually in traditional finance, if you lend your assets or if you are a market maker or whatnot, there's some nicely well-defined definitions of like who owns the asset at what time, when things are transferred, who has how much of what asset and whatnot. So when it comes to liquidity pools, sometimes there's a little bit of complication in this area when the liquidity pool itself is by definition a decentralized technology. And so when a lot of different liquidity providers come together, they provide their assets in a pool. So what happens is when users use these assets from the liquidity pool, so now there's some question of when a user, for instance, borrows from a liquidity pool, whose asset did they borrow? Now, how much of the asset do the liquidity providers have? And this question is important for things like, for instance, when you have assets that have yield, like dividends, for instance, for stocks, or even for stocks that have like governance or like voting rights and stuff like that. So now how do you determine who gets to vote, for instance? So that's the kind of research that I focused on. Yeah.
Okay. And Peter, could you give some suggestion for my student if they like to continue their RWA research?
Yeah, so my focus is on infrastructure finance. And a number of years ago, 5, 6 years ago or so, we got a call from TIAA, which is a major pension fund in the United States. They're the third largest holder of municipal bonds that fund most or finance most of the infrastructure in the US. That's about 4.3 trillion outstanding. And they said, you know, we have a lot of performance information, not just financial performance, but also operational performance information available, I guess, on all these assets that are being financed, and wanted to look at a way to kind of capture, do data assetization, I guess, around these infrastructure assets in many different verticals. This is water, energy, roads, ports, airports, hospitals. There's like 21 of them, right? And so the question then became, well, what is a good model, I guess, that we could use, or a good approach that we could use for tokenization and data assetization, I guess, around these types of infrastructure assets. So this has been, has been taken off over the last few years. Hasn't become adopted yet, but at least we're looking sort of at the interest is there from the asset manager, and the interest is also there from the asset owner's perspective, because the tokenization opportunity might potentially, in the future, reduce cost of debt from say, 150 basis points to 30 basis points through tokenization. And that's something where there was a lot of interest in sort of rethinking the bond market, the municipal bond market. And in fact, we've gotten some tokenization only investment funds out of the UAE now interested in that. So they're backed by a Saudi sovereign wealth fund to essentially start refinancing a lot of these bond-financed assets using tokenized infrastructure.
Okay. I also like to learn something from you guys. If you want to offer course related to RWA, should we invite industry speakers to share, real assets from their industry, something like T-bond or mutual funds. So those kind of very real things for students that never touched before. How do you think? For the course we plan to offer. And actually this is difficult topics for students to learn technology and the real world assets. Yeah, they don't have assets experience. So that's complicated for students to get you just mentioned about digital assets. They don't have any assets. They have a GameFi, and they don't have much experience for those experience, how they to tokenize them.
I think
you wanna
I think she's a young generation. She don't have any assets before. That's what we need to deal with our students' problem.
Yeah, I think from a student's perspective, when it comes to things like blockchain or tokenization, then I think when it comes to, like, for instance, computer engineering students, a lot of us tend to think, okay, we just need to learn the technology, we just need to know how these things work. But yeah, I think there definitely needs to be a lot to learn about, like, the finance, the economics behind all these things. Like, for instance, what are these different types of assets? What makes them different? How does tokenizing these things maybe require different types of like technology or infrastructures to support them, depending on how these assets actually interact with other things in real life, or what kind of contracts that they have, like compared to, like equities, debts, they're all different and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, so you learn by yourself what the assets can be digitalized or tokenized, right?
I think for a classroom, it's like complicated, right? Yeah, you have a lot of things to kind of combine in terms of education.
Okay, so Peter, how you to fill this gap for students that never have experience for digitalize their assets? They only have gaming experience.
Yeah, it is interesting, right? Because we tend to think sort of universities have sort of a lot of these answers baked in and whatever, you have all the professors, all the students. It doesn't quite work out that way because the field moves so quickly that by the time they get sort of the next professor starting to teach and do the research, the field has really moved ahead by about a generation, right? So what I tend to do, I have a fairly large group of sort of masters and PhD students doing this research around the real world assets. I said, okay, what's the first thing we want to do? It says not to take a course. You're going to go work with Michigan blockchain. So it's essentially undergraduate students that do peer-to-peer training, a group of about 300 students that do peer-to-peer training on designing contracts and looking at these real-world assets. They already are actually validators on Uniswap and whatnot. So, I mean, they're very active, I guess, in the ecosystem and train each other. So I tell the 26 or the 28-year-old, I mean, swallow your pride and you go learn from the 19-year-old, I guess, on how to do things, before you sort of go loose in this world. And I think it's good. I mean, there's both top-down as well as bottom-up education. And of course, and then you have all the folks, I mean, that are in the room here and those that are in enterprise and startups and whatnot. So then we engage them as well. One of the companies that we're very actively working with is Triangle Digital. It's a company in both in New York and in Bermuda, working in the insurance space and whatnot. So we engage an ecosystem of private firms as well, startups mainly, I guess, to sort of bring then that applied space and connect it up, because what the students have learned kind of in a bottom-up manner to come up with sort of meaningful answers and solutions to the problem.
Yeah. Okay. Then we'd like to talk about the infrastructure that you can comment on. If we like to launch a research center to engage infrastructure, what's your suggestion?
Particularly, I mean, launching a center costs money. Right, and when you're thinking right now, I guess what's happening with the research enterprise in the United States, I mean, there's sort of a full-out attack right now, the administration on universities, right? So trying to launch these research centers, essentially what we do is we couple together coalitions, I guess, that bring together both the private sector and the public sector. So I think a lot more of these center type of activities are going to be public-private enterprises, we have to find sort of use cases that the private sector is also directly interested in. So another use case that we have is the agriculture United States, which is also right now in peril, I guess, because of tariffs and all of that, because you can't export our soy and our wheat and our hogs. So that's another problem that we got. But irrespective of that, agriculture is financed in the US through the bond market. So there's an agricultural bond market. Bonds are sold to Wall Street, right? And that fills up the balance sheet of big agricultural banks. They lend out the farm credit. Farm credit goes to the farmer. So that whole trickle down from pricing risk in the bond market and taking it all the way down into the lending market to the farmer is an application use case where we recently got funded, I guess, to start looking at rethinking how tokenization and better performance metrics, because, I mean, farming is becoming smart farming, right? We get a lot more data on not only crop, but also on moisture, on also nutrient characteristics, I guess, that yield crops, for example, if you're dealing with row crops. How can you take that information and load it onto a blockchain and sort of track that risk through various different, green and brown and intermediate kind of loans, I guess, all the way from farm to the bond market, as well as all the way to the CPGs. These are the buyers of our agricultural product. So it's a pretty complex enterprise and ecosystem, but it's one that is incredibly inefficient at this point and not good at responding to external disruptions and things that are happening right now. So building these centers requires sort of a couple of very good use cases. And I just want to, sorry, I'm hogging time here, one more. So there's one more use case we're working on that we already started working on before Trump got elected, and that was all about FEMA. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, right? It's basically the agency that builds out infrastructure to respond, I guess, to emergencies. So that is also getting defunded now at the federal level, right? So no response to hurricanes, no response to nothing. So then the question is, how do you respond to that, right? I mean, in every crisis, there is a response. And again, I think the opportunity of blockchain and tokenization and whatnot creates a whole new opportunity in this space. We're looking right now with some funding at financing a decentralized, no longer FEMA, it would be SEMA for state or REMA for region, regional ecosystem, essentially of emergency management agencies, but financed through tokenization mechanisms. And so if you can identify a couple of these really pivotal economic levers, I guess, that are of interest both to the private sector and to the public sector, it becomes a lot easier to actually put together center activities like that.
Yeah, I love the idea from the fund to the bond, the tokenized bond. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be traded cross-border. Do you like to share your experience for from fund to the bond, or from real assets to the bond? Any idea you like to share?
From assets to bonds?
Yeah. What kind of a real world asset to the bond market? And it's easy to exchange on blockchain.
I think one of the assets that are being looked into when it comes to like tokenization that is maybe not that popular, I guess, but I've seen some research on this. Is there's I think it's called like the carbon credit market. So it's essentially, I guess, when projects have some kind of carbon emissions, and then in order to offset these emissions, they purchase carbon credits from other projects that are green infrastructure projects and whatnot. And so there's some use case to tokenize these carbon credits, or at least create a blockchain market for these type of credits. And part of it is that kind of cross-border thing. You don't want to have limit of the funding from from the same country that the infrastructure project is from. Like, you can generate a lot more income if you have cross-border participation in terms of investment. And also, there's maybe some regulatory, or not necessarily regulatory, but just the investor sentiment that is in one country may be different from another country. So having that access cross-border, I think, is a use case for this kind of tokenization of like maybe a market that is not spoken about that often, but there's definitely some research there.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned the carbon credits, right? I mean, that's sort of a big part in our, agricultural finance program also, because it is an area where there is very poor transparency, right? Very poor transparency, lots of double counting, lots of other issues, I guess, that plague sort of efficiency in that particular market. And I think these credits are becoming more and more important also as, say, the European Union is starting to institute its CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is essentially a carbon tax and stuff that gets imported. And now we have two Republican senators, very interesting, that say, well, essentially a carbon tax is kind of like a tariff. How about we call it instead of a tariff, we call it a carbon tax too. We say, well, whatever floats your boat, I'm all for carbon tax if you call it credit. So now we're trying to import the same thing in the US. there's a proposal. But again, you need to be able to then to effectively track, I guess, that real world asset, right? I mean, these carbon credits to be able to, you know, make transparent, I guess, your goods that flow across borders.
I think the transparency, so of course there's the transparency from blockchain that we get from, I guess, transactions and whatnot on the blockchain, but there needs to be also transparency level off the chain as well, right? Because these things are happening off chain.
Right.
So the actual, you know, reporting and auditing and whatnot, these things happen off chain. And even if data that gets put on chain is transparent, who is checking what's happening off chain to begin with, right?
Okay. Can we touch more about the carbon credit based on your from farm to bond? Can we convert the farm assets into carbon credits for trading online, on-chain? Make it transparent and easy to trade.
Yeah, so when it comes to carbon credits, there's a lot of issues associated with it, right? So there's one, I mean, as you say, I mean, what's happening off chain, so you want to make sure, I guess, that the right information, I guess, makes it on chain, right? So then, assuming that it is on chain, so we work, as I said, we work with some of the companies that will then mint those carbons and actually, you know, trade them on an exchange. Right, so that's one, but the other piece of it is compliance, right? I mean, carbon credits are part of a compliance or not carbon credits, but carbon disclosures, part of a compliance mechanism. So that is an entirely sort of different rail, I guess, that we're trying to pursue. One is the trading, the other one is the meeting compliance requirements, particularly when it comes to financing mechanisms, because you know, bonds get priced differently, I guess, with compliance versus without compliance, right? So you have different costs, I guess, as you're repricing these bonds. The same goes with loans. I mean, there's the green loans, the brown loans, and all of that. You have to again figure out, I mean, how we're going to be capturing the information and putting it on chain so that we can actually figure out how to reprice all these individual loans to hundreds of thousands of farmers, for example, but then ultimately you have to aggregate it and then it becomes part of a trading mechanism. I think under the current, and Brad was talking about it this morning, I think we are going to get sort of a digital act, I guess, in the United States finally, which might allow, we've been discussing with the Senate Finance and Banking Committee, not just myself, but sort of a whole group of people, to figure out if we can get carbon regulated under CFTC so that they become essentially a digital asset, so carbon as a digital asset, in which case it becomes really a true trading mechanism rather than just an exchange, right? And I think a lot of that has to happen essentially through the mechanisms, the RWA mechanisms that we're talking about here.
Okay. So Reina, could you give final comments on tokenization?
Yeah, so I think for tokenization, of course, there's a lot of work from industry, from academia and whatnot. I would say that one thing that we have to watch out for in tokenization is that when it comes to the intermediaries, so one draw towards tokenization is the efficiencies that we can get because of disintermediation. But now, sometimes when we think of the tokenization frameworks, we're reintroducing intermediaries, and we're saying, okay, what new roles are these intermediaries taking? So we have to be careful on like, what is the end goal here? Do we want what role do we want intermediaries to play? Do we still want them there? And how does that affect how the protocol, how the frameworks are working?
Okay. Thank you, Reina. Time's fly. The half hour just passed away. And thank you, everyone. If you'd like to contact with our panelists after this session, you are welcome. And thank you all for today.